This is August 26, 2003 at Manhattan, Raleigh County, Kansas. The camera operator is Rosemary Visser. Wilton, we are pleased that you'll record your military experiences. Now, would you give your name, rank, serial number, and branch of service?
Well, I'm Wilton B. Thomas. At the end of the war, I was a captain, battalion motor officer, although most of my combat duty was as a company motor officer and at the rank of first lieutenant. What else do you want to know?
Name, rank, serial number, your serial number.
010115553.
Never forget that number. And then your branch of service, of course.
Well, I was in armored force all the time. The papers show infantry armored force, I think, but I was always at Fort Knox or with the 716th Tank Battalion throughout the war.
Okay. Now tell us a little bit about your home life before we get into your military experience. Where did you grow up and some of your early experiences?
Well, I grew up on a small farm in Clay County, Kansas, actually on the farm that my great-grandfather homesteaded in 1870. And, of course, I got out of high school in 1930. And that was the time of the market crash in 29, followed by the dust storms and the deep depression of the mid-30s. So it was tough times. I worked around the community actually for $1 a day, or I shucked popcorn for 10 cents a bushel, stuff like that. And after 3 years of that, I was awarded a Union Pacific $100 4-H scholarship to K-State and decided, well, I can't let that $100 get away, so I'll try and see if I can make it. So I started out at K-State in the fall of 33. And at the end of the first semester, what little money I'd accumulated in that 3-year period, plus the first half of that scholarship was gone. I had a scholarship that paid my tuition and books, $50 at that time, paid tuition and books in College of Agriculture at K-State. And I worked and borrowed all the rest of the way through at 25 cents an hour in the Ag Econ department. And I also waited tables at a cafe in Abilene, and I was house manager of the fraternity 1 year, so I worked at 2 jobs 2 of the years.
What were you doing at the time you went into the service?
Well, I took a job out of college as a cattle buyer for Keith Packing Company, which was headquartered in Arkansas City at that time. But I spent most of my time on the stockyards in Oklahoma City.
And can you remember? I know you remember where you were at Pearl Harbor, but tell us about it.
Well, I was in the 1st Armored Division at that time.
You were in the service.
Yes, I was drafted. I was in the early draft out of Clay County. That was my official address, although I was living in Oklahoma City at the time. I was in the first big bunch of draftees and went into the service on February 18 of 41. That's the February ahead of Pearl Harbor. And we went on maneuvers in the early fall of 41. Terribly poor equipment. One of the jobs I had early on was to make 30 caliber and 50 caliber machine guns for use on maneuvers on the Jeeps and trucks and half-track or scout cars. We didn't have half-tracks yet at that time. And a 30 caliber machine gun was a piece of 2x4 about 2.5 feet long and painted black and bolted onto the gun mount. A 50 caliber machine gun was a piece of 2x6, about 3 feet long, and bolted onto the gun mount on scout cars or trucks or tanks or whatever was on. That's the kind of equipment that we had at that time. The public doesn't realize that we went into World War II terribly short on equipment, and the equipment at best was not good.
How did Pearl Harbor influence you, the bombing there?
Well, when we got off of maneuvers, they had orders in company headquarters to discharge all the draftees on December 15th if they were over 28 years of age, which I was. And when we pulled into Fort Knox that morning, there was a troop train headed for Louisville. When we were razzing the dickens out of the other draftees, 8 more days, we're going to be on that baby headed home, and you guys are still going to be stuck here. Before we got our bunks made up that day, December 7th, 41, the radio flashed the news that Pearl Harbor was under bombing attack, and we knew that early discharge had gone bye-bye in a hurry. So that's what an early memory.
Were you in office time or?
No, I was. I trained as a corporal tank gunner, basically, and then the day before the 1st Armored Division pulled out of Fort Knox to go overseas, they posted 6 names on the bulletin board to transfer and await assignment to Officer Candidate School. I was one of the 6. And I'm living on borrowed time from that day, Bill, because the battalion that I trained with is the 1st Armored that hit Rommel's forces in North Africa. That battalion was just wiped out in one day. So I'm on borrowed time from that day. When we moved to Camp Chaffee, Lady Jo went with me. She'd been at Fort Knox with me. We lived in a huge duplex there. At Valley Station, Kentucky. This duplex, believe me, Bill, was 12 feet by 20 feet. Often people getting seasick. And of course, just going out of the harbor, it was just like sitting here in a room. There was no rolling. There were no big waves in the harbor. We got off the coast, and the next morning we were in the ground swells off the California coast. It still wasn't rough water, but there was a distinct roll to the ship. And there were 42 officers in our outfit. John Huntington, Captain Huntington from Chicago, really wanted to die. He was terribly seasick. I was the next most seasick, and I was evaluating the choices between dying and putting up with being seasick. I didn't eat a meal for 5 days, Bill. And I was never seasick again. And we were in rough water several times later on. I had 13 ship rides in the Pacific. We were island hopping on different combat operations, and we saw some rough water. But I was never seasick again, fortunately. It took us 33 days to get to Buda, New Guinea, where we were in training, actually. They were assembling massive numbers of troops for the invasion of the Philippines. The heavy fighting there at Buna was over with. There were terrible casualties before we were there. 32nd Infantry Division, for example, and the military cemeteries there. You can't believe how many little white crosses were lined up there in that cemetery. It was a beautifully kept cemetery, but it really sobered you to see what it was like. In December, we moved, it was 4th of July when we got to Buna. In early December, we moved up to Hollandia in Dutch New Guinea, where we landed and spent a few weeks waterproofing our vehicles for the first combat landing. So when you're going in through the salt water, you've got to have your tanks and half-tracks waterproofed. Jeeps, everything was waterproofed for going out through the water. And then we left there December 26th for combat landing. We didn't know where we were going, but we just knew we were going for combat landing. And it was the 9th of January when we landed at Lingayen Gulf, which is about 100 miles northwest of Manila on the big northern Philippine island of Luzon. I had a couple of 3 interesting experiences on that ship ride going for that first landing. One of them, we saw very few kamikaze planes came in over the fleet. Most of them didn't get where we ever saw them because there was a screen of destroyers and cruisers out beyond the convoy to knock down those kamikazes as they tried to come in. But we saw a few, and one of them dove on the ship right next to the one we were on. He was close enough, and I could clearly see the pilot's face as he was coming down there, diving on that ship. He'd been above the clouds, but we knew he was up there, and all the anti-aircraft crews were on their guns, assuming that he was going to come through the clouds, which he did pretty soon, and dove on that ship next to us. And there was just a cone of red tracers, anti-aircraft fire on that plane as he was diving for that other ship. But until he was pretty close to that ship, he hadn't personally been hit, apparently, because his face was clear. It wasn't distorted as a man who'd been hit by anti-aircraft fire would have been. So he wasn't injured until just before he hit the water. And his plane went into the water on the other side of the ship, so we didn't see it actually hit the water. We saw lots of pieces of plane fly in the air as that plane blew apart when it hit the water.
Did he damage the ship?
His bob went forward of the ship. He didn't hit the ship with it. He didn't. The answer is no. He didn't do any damage to the ship. Then, the night before our combat landing, which had been the night of January 8 and 9, I drew duty on the bridge of that ship. There had to be an Army officer on duty as liaison with the Navy all the time after we got in dangerous waters, which were for quite a ways, of course, for liaison in case something went wrong. So I was up there on that bridge, and I happened to pull a midnight shift. I think it probably was a 4-hour shift. And the radio was on, just an open voice, talking about what we were running into, and they were telling the Navy that there was one battery they hadn't been able to knock out, and they gave the coordinates where this battery was located. And then we landed. Well, I didn't know there were that many ships in the world. Now, Lingayen Gulf is 24 miles across, and it was packed with naval vessels. Every sort you can imagine, except, of course, no aircraft carriers in there in that tight spot in there, because they were a prime target, and they were out where they had some protection. But there were battleships and cruisers and destroyers and all kinds of tiny landing craft and little smoke-throwing craft that would put down smoke screens on the beach and that sort of thing. And we went in, I think it was about noon when we made our first touch on the beach. And we were in an LST, landing ship tank, which is a much larger ship than you'd imagine. There was a lot of armor going off of that ship when we started unloading. And there was a little heavy mortar fire on the beach. And they dropped a big shell closer to me than I am to you here, Bill, but on the outside of that landing ship door. And the shell didn't come through, but it made a huge bulge in that heavy steel door, and I got peppered with a bunch of little junk that popped off of that door.
But you were safe.
Well, not completely safe. The guy beside me, I don't think ever saw action again. The concussion from that shell going off was like no thunderclap you or I ever heard. And I kind of laughed afterwards. I said, I must have been more chicken than he was. Apparently I had my helmet real tight down over my ears. Or maybe it was my cauliflower ears from K-State Wrestling. I don't know. Anyway, I didn't get any head damage from that concussion. But this guy that was standing beside me had serious damage, and he was taken to the hospital, and I doubt he ever saw action again. I hope he made a good recovery. We didn't hear any more from him. But I got peppered with that stuff, and they took me up to the hospital ward and patched me up. And Colonel Peterson said, "Thomas, you get a Purple Heart for that." I said, "Colonel, people that lose arms and legs get Purple Hearts. I'm not taking a Purple Heart for getting peppered with this little stuff." Well, when the war was over, a Purple Heart was worth 5 points toward getting home early. And I was still eligible for it, so I accepted a Purple Heart after the war was over. And I got home exactly the same minute I'd have got home without it, actually. I got home, well, there's a lot of delay. Actually, I wasn't discharged until the 17th of March, 1946. And the war was over in August.
How long did you spend in the service then?
Well, supposedly a year. But there are 61 months to the day in that year. 5 years and a month. So, anyway, so much for that. We landed, well, they backed the LST off after a while to get out of that mortar fire and finish unloading. We had our tanks off. They wanted them in there for obvious purposes, and we had our half tracks off. But the trucks and jeeps and stuff, they backed off for a couple hours to let the shore fire quiet down, and then we landed again and got our trucks and jeeps and so forth off then. We were under fire by one big gun there on the beach. The Japs had captured an American naval artillery piece, a 12-inch gun, when they came into the islands in 42. They had that rascal mounted on tracks in a cave some miles back up in the mountains. And they'd throw odd rounds of 12-inch shells down in there on the beach, which was pretty heavy shelling, of course. And where one of those had landed, it made a huge crater. Corporal Peterson, one of our half-track drivers, had a chunk of steel that came off of one of those shells that he picked up and he carried it, I think, clear through the war on the side of his half-track for a souvenir. So they were right in where we were, but they were scattered out. They're just occasional shells, but that was a rather low velocity shell coming in, but it was a big baby, and we could hear it coming in. We'd hear the whistle as it was coming in, and then the concussion when it went off. Well, we spent 3 days on the beach, and then we moved up to a little village of Pozorubio, about 10 miles inland, and that's where we did our heaviest fighting, and we lost the most tanks and men by far that we lost during the total operation at that location. And the Japs were dug in on Hill 355. That meant that the top of that ridge was 355 feet above sea level. But they had gun emplacements and personnel emplacements hidden all over that ridge. And we lost a lot of men there. We lost 5 tanks and 15 men in 10 minutes one evening. When 2 tanks had gotten in trouble up there and called for help to get out, and B Company sent 7 tanks up there to get them out. Lieutenant Bunley's platoon of 5 tanks, we lost all 5 of his tanks plus Ed Munley, and 14 of his men. The other 2 tanks got back, but they tried to go up the east side of a ridge just before sundown with the sun in their face, and they couldn't see what they were getting into. And they got into heavy fire, and tanks are... Our tanks at that time, which were Sherman tanks, were subject to burning up from mortar fire or hand grenades or artillery fire if it hit on the back deck. That just set the engine afire, and it was gone then. And we lost all of Ed's platoon, including Ed and 14 of his men. 10 of them crawled out through the grass and one thing and another and got back to company sometime during the night or the next morning. But that was the heaviest losses we had at any time. But we lost 2 other tanks up on that ridge one day, and we lost some others around that area at times.
And what was your responsibility at this time?
Taking care of the equipment. But that was my assigned responsibility. But in effect, I was also light reconnaissance leader. This is what would happen. The old man would say, Thomas, I want you to get a couple jeep loads of guys and go and check out this or that or the other thing. One time on Mindanao, for example, he said, I want you to get a couple of jeep loads of volunteers. I had to go get guys that would agree to go with me. I could take all my own guys because I had to keep the crew working on the equipment and everything, but I'd take a few of them and others I could pick up. And I want you to go up to Malabang and see what's going on up there. That was 25 miles up the coast. And that was just that's one example. That happened several times, a number of times, including once in New Guinea, when we had a kid get lost and drowned, and he said, I want you to get a bunch of guys and go and see if you can find Keith Bryan drowned. Well, we went through the rainforest the whole day hunting for any place, and the sergeant that had been with him, they'd gone fishing Sunday afternoon, and they got lost out there, and they had packs on their backs, and they tried to cross the swamp, and Keith was a wonderful, nice farm kid from Iowa, friend of mine, corporal, and he was built like I am. He was a short guy, and the sergeant was a tall guy, and he got through, but Keith went under and drowned. The sergeant never could find where he'd been, and so we never did find his body, and well, that's all it was. But that was an example of the extra activities I had fairly often. But my basic responsibility was take care of the equipment. And Bill, I had a whale of a good bunch of guys assigned to my outfit: tank mechanics and wheel vehicle mechanics, radio men, armorers take care of the weaponry, and so on. A bunch of guys that, well, I've said many times, if I ever had to go back in combat again and had my pick of guys to take, I'd just take exactly the ones I had. They were good. We're taking too much time here. One souvenir I brought back is this carbine. That's our outfit was. We fought on Luzon for quite a little while. Then they pulled us out to resupply with men and equipment because we'd lost quite a lot of tanks, quite a lot of men. And we'd just been cleaning up equipment a few days, and we got a radio message: we want your assault gun platoon down at Manila. And that was 5 tanks. We had 5 tanks. I was in headquarters company. We had 5 tanks with 105 millimeter howitzers in them that were fired more as artillery rather than as rifles, whereas the regular tank guns were a higher velocity gun and fired more as rifles. They were reducing the big buildings down near the Intramuros in Manila, and the Japanese were dug into them till you can't imagine. And the municipal building had a whole bunch of halls in it, reinforced concrete, and they wanted our tanks down there to help blow that building apart. And we'd run 1 tank up there at a time, loaded with 105 shells, white phosphorus, and high explosive, alternating. One high explosive shell and a white phosphorus shell. And beside them was a 155 howitzer with a big steel shield so the Japs couldn't pick them off from inside that building. They were firing alternate high explosive and white phosphorus shells in there. And our tanks were there for 10 days doing that. And that's had been going on before we were there. And it was that long before they got that building cleaned out. And there was terribly heavy fighting. For example, one day they thought they had one big hallway cleared, and they sent in a platoon of 17 infantrymen to secure that hall. 2 of them got back out. That's how bad it was. Like 15 out of 17 were lost in that hall because the Japs were dug into a pile of junk there with a machine gun, and they just mowed them down. Well, the only 2 Japanese soldiers that I ever saw surrender were at this site. And just at daylight one morning, 2 young Japanese soldiers, stark naked, came out with their hands up and surrendered to the infantry. Now, to my knowledge, our tank battalion never took a Japanese prisoner. They would not surrender to a tank outfit. We took back occasional prisoners that the infantry would pick up, usually wounded, that they'd pick up and take back to take care of and put them in the hospital, fix them up, and all that. Later on in the war, since I'm mentioning prisoners, the infantry turned over a tall young fella that they captured to our outfit, and this was a guy from Taiwan. And he was highly educated, spoke at least as good English as I do, perhaps better. And I got to visit with this guy for quite a little while until they were ready to haul him back to the camp where he was headed. And he emphasized, Taiwan, Taiwan, not Japanese, Taiwan, Taiwan. Because he figured he's going to get better treatment. And of course, they were all told they'd be executed if they were captured, or most of them were. And so he was emphasizing that he was Taiwanese, not Japanese, and he'd been conscripted. And I don't know anything about the circumstances where he was captured, but anyway, he was picked up, and we had him there for some time that day until the people came to haul him back to the prisoner of war location. But I didn't see very many prisoners of war at any time. In Europe, there were huge prisoner of war camps. I saw very few. Once in a while, you'd see a truckload of Japanese prisoners that were being moved somewhere, but very few. They would not surrender. People have no idea how tenacious they were. They would fight till they were gone. That was their creed. We went, well, let's see. The first guy we lost in combat, to my knowledge, was Colonel Peterson. And it was in that same location at Pausa Rubio. And before we secured that ridge, actually, D Company, our light tank company, had gone up toward, what's the resort town? Where? Yeah, where they were fighting up toward. That's not right, is it? Anyway, toward that resort area up there, and they got in trouble, and they called for our assault gun platoon to come up there, and Colonel Peterson went up with them to get D Company out of the trap they got into, and the platoon leader's tank was knocked out. The artillery had knocked the track off of it, so they were immobilized. They couldn't move, and their radio antenna was shot away. Colonel Peterson couldn't get them on the radio to tell them the tank was on fire, and they had to get out of there right now because it was going to blow up. And Colonel Pete wasn't going to see them blow up in that tank, so he got out of his and went over there and hammered on their hatch and said, "Diz, get your crew out of there. You're going to blow up." And the Japs got a mortar shell close there and put big chunks of steel through his liver. he lived 3 days, I think, but he was gone. And to my knowledge, that's the first man lost in our battalion, and that was a sad loss because he was a very competent and popular officer with the outfit.
What was your evaluation of the officers that
We had